It was at least 20 years ago when I was a member of Mark McKeown's email list, and I got into this huge discussion with somebody else about martial arts. We both practiced the same art, came from it from very different points of view, and ended up discussing what was true, what was not, and so on. And it got quite heated at a certain point, mostly on my end. And we discussed for such a long time and argued that the moderator said, like, guys, cut it out. If you guys want to keep this going after all these weeks, do it outside of this forum. And because we're tired of hearing you two go at it like that. At the end of that, we decided to basically call it quits. And the other person said, like, okay, thanks for the exchange, basically. And he mentioned that the goal of a good discussion is not to convince the other party of you being right and them being wrong and convert them to your cause or your opinion, but actually to have the exchange. That the value is in the exchange, not in the end result. That was for me an eye-opening because I realized that I was basically being too emotional and not viewing his side enough, and that I was arguing and discussing in a very unproductive manner, both for him and for me. Nobody was winning anything; everybody was losing, and that was at least 50% my fault. So I decided that it was time to do something about it, and very gradually tried to do better. I still fail, like everybody else, because we're human. But the goal is to get better at having productive discussions that lead somewhere, as opposed to these huge screaming matches, whether live or in a virtual manner by typing things out in comment sections and so on. So trying to avoid having a result where the only thing that you get is the other party is even more firmly entrenched in their position, and so are you, and nothing was gained from that exchange, but a lot was lost. Now, I give you this little flashback to the recent discussion I had with Mark McKeown about the state of Western societies and what's going on here. And we argued, not really, but we discussed a lot of what we saw going on and was going wrong in today's societies, mostly in the West. And I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes if you wanna hear that talk that we had. Now, one of the things we have lost is the ability to discuss things rationally with each other. And that is what I want to talk about today so that we can hopefully get to a better place. Now, long story short, and again, the long story is in the talk that I had with Mark. So again, I'm going to refer to that for all the details. But what we've seen is ideological capture with postmodernism and the wokeness and so on. And that is a long discussion in and of itself, because it's a lot more nuanced than saying wokeness is the worst thing ever and wokeness is totally without value. Both positions are, in my opinion, wrong. But to say that it's not been a net positive is to put it mildly, in my opinion. If you disagree with that, that's fine, but that is my opinion, and I've expanded on that in the past many times on social media and elsewhere. The result, again, of what we've seen from those ideologies is a polarization in society to the extreme. Now, historically, that leads to very bad outcomes. And what can you do about that? So, when I was talking offline with Mark about this podcast episode we wanted to do talking about that, I realized that my position of not wanting politics or religion on my social media was untenable, because it was going to be impossible to have an honest, open, and detailed and nuanced discussion about this topic with Mark if I kept up saying, like, I don't want any politics on my social media. Because how can you discuss politics and then not give the people commenting on your internet presence the same tools, give them that same benefit that I then take for myself? So I'm like, okay, I can't. This would be hypocritical, so I can't really keep this up. So as a result, I changed my policy, and I'll put a link to my comments policy that I've had for years, which is quite extensive and I believe is very reasonable. And so I included what would be allowed talking about political issues, mainly because everything's become political. That is the biggest issue that I see nowadays. If everything is political, that means that there's nothing that is quote unquote neutral ground, meaning where can people who are on opposing sides politically get together? Because that is how you make a society function. There needs to be common ground, there needs to be things we agree upon. And we should be able to say, like, okay, no matter how I think you are wrong in your political views, we are still an XYZ, meaning a member of this society, of this country, of this nation, whatever it is, so that we can work together to make it function. If that completely goes away, the only possible outcome of that is conflict. If compromise is impossible, if communication becomes impossible, then conflict is all that is left. Nobody should want that. Historically, we have countless precedents of how horrible that can end up. Now, the second reason why I am doing this episode today is because what I see nowadays is the pushback against this postmodernist ideology that has gone throughout society, and that's DEI, ESG. Look that up if you don't know what that means, which has become policy of big companies and governments for the last few years, has gone to such absurd extremes that a lot of people say this is too much, this is too far. Whether rightfully so or not is not my point. I'm only stating that I see that people are fighting back against this ideology. Which brings up the question, well, can they go too far? Because in history we see that repeating over and over again. If society goes all the way to the left, the backlash is eventually it goes to the right again. But it doesn't necessarily stop in the middle. It tends to go far right. And then vice versa, back to the left again. So this swinging from the left to the right in the extremes is what I think we want to avoid, because it's at the extremes that the most damage is done for many people. And what can we do nowadays when what I see is, and the best example of that is the Bud Light controversy with the trans person, Dylan Mulvaney. And again, look that up. You'll find plenty of news articles about that. That resulted in a boycott of Bud Light, which had a huge effect on their bottom line, and lots of things happened. And again, too long to go into here, but this is the biggest example I saw recently of people pushing back against what they think or perceive as being completely over the top ideological positions from companies. If it happens to a company, it will happen to governments as well. That pushback can also end up being very extreme. Now, I don't care where you land on this issue, whether you agree or disagree. I don't care. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is avoiding things going too far. If you are on the side who favors this boycott, then you are pushing back against what you think the people promoting this ideology are pushing too far. You're against that. The people who are promoting it think maybe your boycott is going way too far, and they're pushing against that. So then it ends up being extremism against extremism if this is allowed to get out of hand. And when I say this is allowed, meaning that this is a natural tendency of conflicts getting bigger and escalating. So what to do? What I believe is a good thing to do for everybody is to get back to rational discussions, get back to discussing things with people you oppose ideologically, politically, and otherwise, and actually discuss this. Have the open forum of ideas, the open marketplace of ideas, basically the old concept. Bring that back without necessarily vilifying and othering the opposing side. There's no need for that. Now, when I say that, a lot of people think, well, you don't have to turn the other cheek. That's not what I'm talking about. You start by discussing in good faith. When the opposing side clearly demonstrates bad faith, then you stop, then it ends. Because then they make their intentions clear, meaning they want conflict. If you are engaged in a conflict, pretending that you're not is the worst possible thing. We've talked about Pain Quinn's 5 rules of avoiding violence. That is one of them. Don't pretend it isn't happening. So if you are suddenly finding yourself in such a conflict with somebody acting in bad faith, well, then you stop arguing or discussing as if that is not the case. The analogy that I use, and I explained more in depth in my talk with Mark, is that of the broken bridge. Society is like a broken bridge. There's people on both sides. Well, if you want to make a functional society, again, you have to reach out a hand to somebody standing on that other side. But you don't do so naively, because if that person is acting in bad faith, then he will pull you across so you fall into the void between into the opening between both bridges, and you end up being victimized. You don't want that. But if you don't reach out with your hand, then no peace can ever be found. No end of conflict can ever be found. So reaching out tentatively, carefully, but in good faith, is, I think, an excellent way to avoid your own side going too far, because that is what typically happens. One side goes too far, the other one reacts to it, it escalates, and they go too far as well, and that cycle continues. So I believe good faith discussions are the way to go. But what does that mean, discussing rationally? Well, what I like very much is this graph that I posted years ago, about 10 years ago, on one of my blog articles, and it's called How to Have a Rational Discussion. And I've got it pulled up here, and it's basically a graph. Again, the link is in the show notes. And it's a flow chart. It starts with the question, can you envision anything that will change your mind on this topic? If the answer is no, this is not a discussion. You don't talk about this topic. You just stop immediately. There's no point. If you cannot change somebody's mind, if they say there's nothing that can change my mind, then you are with somebody who's ideologically captured, who's basically in a cult, that they're dogmatic, they refuse to believe anything else. There's no point discussing with that person, because they will not do so in good faith. And you cannot change their mind, they just told you. So that is where it stops immediately. If the answer is yes, and again, we get back to good faith, you're going to have to start by assuming good faith. If the answer is yes, the next question is, if one of your arguments is shown to be faulty, will you stop using that argument with everyone? If the answer is no, again, this ends the discussion, because that person is not willing to discuss things in good faith. If the answer is yes, you will stop using faulty arguments. Then the next question is, are you prepared to abide by basic principles of reason in discussing this topic? And that means that you have to have evidence for your positions. That means you have to have you have to prove that this evidence actually is correct. You have to try to, for instance, avoid the logical fallacies, like using straw men, using an argument from authority, and all the list of all these logical fallacies that we all fall victim to. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. If the person says no, again, this is not a discussion. If they don't want to use basic, reasonable discussion principles, there's no point, because you will not be able to get to anywhere so that there's a reasonable exchange of ideas. So then, if that person does say yes, then you get a discussion. And the chart continues. This is a discussion. I will talk to you about this topic, provided the following rules are obeyed. Rule number 1, do not introduce new arguments while another argument has yet to be resolved. This is typical, and this is very human, especially if it's a heated discussion where you feel that the other person is actually making a good point, and you are about to get to the point where your point that you're making is shown to be faulty, shown to be wrong, to immediately switch to a different point in the whole discussion. Introduce a new element so that you can avoid being defeated on that specific one. If you do that, that is bad faith. It's very instinctual, but it's wrong. You shouldn't do it, and you shouldn't allow the other party to do the same thing. Second rule, do not move on to another argument if it is shown that a fact that you have relied upon is inaccurate. So this is basically an expansion of that. If one side can show, like, look, you give this argument, but it turns out that your data is wrong. Here is a proof that your data is wrong. For instance, it's outdated. This happens so often. I've been training for a very long time, for decades on end, and many other things when it comes to, for instance, strength and conditioning that were true 30, 35 years ago when I was starting out, turns out that they're not, because the science has moved on and discovered new things. And this is true in all aspects of life on this planet, is that just information will evolve and you will eventually end up being wrong about something. That's perfectly fine. You just have to be able to accept new information as it comes in. Third rule, provide evidence for your position or arguments. Saying, well, that's basically why this is how I experienced it, so it's true for everybody. That is a logical fallacy. That's not evidence. Anecdote is not evidence. It's just an example of something being true once. Doesn't mean that is the rule, doesn't mean that is anything else than just the exception that you live through. So what you want to do is basically provide evidence for your positions. That is not just your opinion, not just your feelings, not just what your morality describes and so on. There needs to be evidence. But a final rule of this is, do not argue that you don't need evidence. If that's what you're saying, you are back to dogma. We're back to being in a cult. You have to accept, in a cult, you have to accept the tenets of the cult, the dogmas of the cult, the positions that are unassailable. You cannot change those. You have to accept them. A lack of evidence is one of them. Now, what I like to say then is that, look, you can say that this is your opinion, but that is not a fact. There's a difference between these two. An opinion is something that you believe to be true. A fact is true. So the chart continues. We've got this discussion. These are the rules. Can you abide by them? If not, then we get back to no. And this is not a discussion. If you say yes, you can move on. Now, at one point, and this is where I kind of disagree with the chart a little bit, the chart continues, did you breach any of these rules in the discussion? If the answer is no, then it says, congratulations, this is how rational human beings exchange IDs. And that is, I agree with that, but it's a little bit too black and white for my taste. If the answer to did you breach any of these rules in the discussion is yes, then the chart says you cheated. The discussion is terminated. You are deemed to have conceded all opposing arguments up to this point. You forfeit any right to complain about the discussion. Now, when I say you cheated, that for me implies that you do this on purpose. I disagree with that. Some people do. Again, we get back to good faith and people acting in bad faith. Obviously, that exists, especially in this polarized society. But it is also extremely human. We all fall prey to that. We all have this tendency, especially when we get into heated arguments, to stray against the rules that we ourselves expect the other party to uphold. So I would be a little bit more lenient when somebody does that. However, I think you should point it out. It's like, look, this is where you agreed upon. You're not sticking to that. This is not an argument. Now, a good faith actor will then say, you know what, you're right, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said that. I take it back. And then we can move on. If they don't, then you're at the point like, okay, they don't want to have an honest, rational discussion, and you can move on. So this is me talking to you about that chart, which I very much recommend everybody take a quick look at. And again, the link is in the show notes, because that will actually help you hold back your own, let's say, negative tendencies when discussing and arguing, because we all have them. So I'll get back a little bit now to the rules that I use on my Facebook page, in my Facebook group and so on, and that I think are important and valuable as a tool to discuss rationally, but also honestly, and also keep yourself honest. So the first one is, like I said, discuss rationally and leads to the graph. The second one is discussing good faith or stay silent. The goal is to find common ground. The goal is not to destroy the other party. If that's your goal, you're not an honest broker in this discussion. You're somebody who just wants to win. I understand that. I get that. But that's not an honest discussion. It's not even a rational discussion because you have a hidden agenda. The goal of the discussion is, like I said, an exchange of ideas and helps you sharpen your own arguments. It helps you understand the other side better, and so on. Now, you don't want to necessarily prove the other side wrong. You don't want to convert them to your position. And if you can avoid those things, then that's fine. If you can't hold back, then it's best to shut up about it and basically admit to yourself that you're not acting in good faith. Now, the next point, which I think is critical, is that you should be able to stop when the discussion has run its course. There's the expression don't beat a dead horse. Basically, at a certain point, everything has been said, and you can get to the conclusion. The conclusion can be that both of you or one of you slightly changed their mind, and because of the information given by the opposing side, or the conclusion can be that nope, we're done. You're crazy, you're an idiot, and this and that, and the other person says the same thing about you. It can happen, but then there's no point continuing. There's no point trying to just keep on going and going and going if you're getting nowhere. And that is perfectly possible even with two people acting in good faith. That you're coming from positions that are so far removed from each other that you cannot really find common ground on a specific topic. And that's fine, but you have to know that upfront and try to avoid it. Next rule is that you don't do what I call carpet bombing, which is just writing, when this is online, but it's also when you talk somebody live or via the internet. Is you don't write these epic length posts that just keep going and going and going. You don't just pile on top of somebody so that 50 people are at the same time going after that person's position. What you want to do is make sure that you make your points, but you don't try to immediately give like this huge epic length post, like writing half a book, so that the person has to parse every single aspect of what you wrote, and then spend hours thinking about it and responding with their own epic length post in return. The analogy is for when you are talking to somebody in person is somebody who just talks very rapidly and just throws one thing after the other, one argument or one aspect of the discussion at you, one stat, one study, and this and that, one after the other. It just keeps coming at you at a rapid pace and it doesn't stop. That's not a way to discuss things. Like I said, you want to have you go for one thing at a time, and then you decide on that, and then you move on to the next one. If you don't, then there can never be a resolution. There can never be a point in which people say, okay, this we agree upon, this we disagree upon, because you don't have the time to just hash it all out. If somebody just machine guns points at you. And the next one now is perhaps the most difficult one, and that is to avoid using logical fallacies or other fallacies. And this is the key part to keep yourself honest, is to start by accepting that you, me, everybody else, we're human beings. The way our brains and minds work means that we will eventually fall victim to using these fallacies. And again, the link will be in the show notes where you can see a long list of them. There's a lot of them. There's so many of them that it's, I think, impossible to not fall victim to them using them yourself. So what we should all strive to do, and that is hard and that is hit and miss, and sometimes we are better at this than other times, but what we should all try to do is try to avoid them. And when somebody points out that you're using a logical fallacy, then accept it. Don't let your ego take over. and hold yourself to the standard you hold the other person to, meaning discuss in good faith, discuss rationally, and then accept that you have to take a loss here and admit to it and then move on. Now, if the other side doesn't want to move on and they want to keep hammering that mistake that you made, well, then again, we stop having a rational discussion. And again, this is difficult because once again, go look at that list of fallacies. You see just how long it is, how easy it is to make it, and how easy it is to get defensive about it and emotional about it because it's difficult, especially in heated discussions or in hot button topics, to basically accept that you might have to give up one of your positions because it turns out that it's wrong. No matter which side you're on, doesn't matter, it's going to happen. So if you cannot do that, well, then I think you're basically wasting everybody's time discussing things. So moving on to the next point, this is, I think, these days very difficult, and it's the following: it's he who becomes emotional or loses his temper loses the argument. What does that mean? Well, being passive aggressive, starting to snap at the other person, or trying to just use um, basically smart ways of using words and or using semantics to try to get them anyway. Those kind of things, or trying to ridicule them, trying to shame them, and so on. That's not an honest discussion. A good example of that is loaded questions. And this is something that I basically don't engage people with anymore if they start like that. They will give you, it's not a question, it's this monologue that they give. And it often starts with, given that, and then they give a long explanation, and which of something that they think or claim is true. Isn't it true that? And then they start accusing you of something, and basically frame the whole point they're making in such a way that the end result, if you don't agree with them, you'll look really, really bad. You look like the biggest asshole in the world. That's not acting in good faith. But a lot of people don't understand that. They don't get that. They think that it's a reasonable way to discuss. I disagree. An example I then give is that, okay, you just gave me a loaded question. I'm going to give you one in return. And my loaded question is, when did you stop beating your wife? Now, that may or may not be true. Doesn't matter. The point of that question is that there's just no way you can come out of that on top. Because if you say, well, last week, then turns out that you did beat her. If you say, I never did, the question itself casts doubt over that. The question itself is meant to undermine your credibility and paint you basically as this horrible person, trying to what we can call poison the well, meaning that anything else that comes from your position is suspect to begin with because you are somebody who beats his spouse. That is a loaded question, and that is not acting in good faith if you use them. So trying to not revert to those kind of what I call low-level tactics is something you should absolutely try to do. Try to just avoid that like the plague, because it leads to nothing. It leads to the other side becoming more firmly entrenched, and the discussion tends to escalate into basically name calling all the time. And that's the next part, no ad hominem, basically, calling the other person names and attacking that character, um, all those kind of things. If you do that, basically you've lost the discussion. There's no point continuing after that. And it's difficult, especially when it comes to politics, for instance, because everything's political now, and people automatically assume if you disagree with them that, well, you must be of whatever opposing party they hate. What I often get is, for instance, when I talk politics with people, which I don't tend to do often online, I prefer to do it in person, is I would say something about a given president of the United States that is negative. And in my lifetime, I've seen a fair bunch of them already. I've yet to find one that I absolutely agree with. So that shouldn't surprise you, because I've stated my opinion on politicians many, many times in the past. For those who don't know, my opinion is that pretty much all of them suck, and that I have very little respect for, like, let's say 99% of them. The occasional exception exists, but they're extremely rare. So what you want to do is avoid talking about parties, but talk about policies and people, how they act and what they propose. Like I said, when I say something about a US president, the person who disagrees with me automatically thinks, well, you must be in favor of Republicans or Democrats or whatever. Depends on which president I'm talking about. I'm like, no, I think that guy is bad just as well, just for different reasons, but he sucks also. And then they're surprised because they thought they could put me in that box. And then on top of that, I tell them, like, look, I don't vote in your country. This is my opinion. Then a lot of them become angry and resort to ad hominem. Well, then you have no right to talk about this, and shut up because you don't even live here. Blah blah blah. Okay, we're done talking, because it's no requirement to live in a country to talk about that. It often is better to have good arguments about that country if you live there, because at least you know something from experience. But it shouldn't be a prerequisite. Now, I can have stupid opinions too, and people can call those out. But the point is that if we automatically put people in boxes, then discussion is difficult to have, because you have these preconceived notions about the other person. They can turn out to be right, these preconceived notions, but you should start by giving people the benefit of the doubt, and you can very quickly move away from that if it turns out they don't deserve it. So I tell people to discuss people and policies, but not parties. And I got that from an older TV show that I really liked, which was Madam Secretary, which is a TV show about politics in Washington, D.C. And one of the cast members in an interview said, we were very proud of the fact that we never mentioned the word Democrat or Republican. They're talking about the people and the policies. Now, if I'm not mistaken, they do that on a rare occasion, but for the most part, they don't. And I think that's a good way to discuss politics. Don't call somebody, Republican or a libtard. Don't talk like that. On the contrary, avoid those kind of words, because it's just party politics. And party politics are nonsense. It's just a waste of everybody's time. It doesn't get you anywhere. A critical aspect of this is that if you cannot call out your own side when they do stupid things and when they make mistakes, and even horrible ones, if you cannot call out your own side, do not call out the other side. Because then you're not principled. Then you're doing partisan politics, and everything your side does is awesome and the other side is horrible. That's nonsense. That is stupid. You're basically claiming then that your side is perfect. It never makes a single mistake. Well, that again is dogmatic. Then you're just in a cult, because you believe the dogma that you have this perfect party, perfect politicians on your side who never make mistakes. That's just complete and utter nonsense. It doesn't matter which side or which party that it is. It just doesn't exist. We're all human beings. So try to be principled and not partisan. And the final point, and I think the most important one, is that whatever it is you're talking about, it could be as stupid as who's the better captain of Star Trek, James T. Kirk or Captain Picard. There are people who have very heated discussions about that and have had those for years on end. Or which is better, Star Trek or Star Wars? I'm not even going to answer that, but there's people, again, who for years, for decades, actually have been screaming at each other for this one. The same thing is true of anything that you can discuss, whether it's political, whether it's martial art. Which martial art is the best? Don't get me started on that one. There is more to life and society than whatever you're discussing at that point. It's not the only thing. And that brings me to the conclusion, and that is, whatever that thing is that you're discussing, discussing, sorry, there's more to life than that, and you should try to find common ground there. Now, none of everything that I said here today is easy. It's relatively simple to understand, but it's not easy to do, especially consistently, especially when you are emotional or you're getting angry or something outrages you. There's nothing wrong with being emotional. You can use that as fuel to be motivated to try to get something to change that you think is horrible or bad. There's nothing wrong with that. There is something wrong by only being driven by emotion and outrage, because that means you are by definition, not thinking rationally. You're not thinking clearly. That is by definition the case if you are very emotional. And the second thing is you will be very easy to manipulate by people who have a hidden agenda. And this has been proven throughout history over and over, that if you are outraged and emotional, you see injustice and you want to act upon it and so on. As soon as you become too emotional, there will be populists that will rise up. And again, left, right, center, doesn't matter. They all do it. Try to take power, try to use you and your outrage so that they can gain power. And typically the first people they turn on is people like you, the ones who help them get to power. You don't have to believe me. You can look up history of the last several centuries, actually, and you will see that this happens over and over all over the world. The antidote to that is rational discussion, which I try to give my perspective on in this episode today. Now, once again, I will be the first to admit that I will sin against my own principles, meaning that I'm human just like anybody else. We all are. I'm getting to be a grumpy old man in my 50s, so I try to be extra careful. But I can understand when people are fed up about certain things, or they more quickly get to the point where they say, like, there's no point talking to you because you are XYZ, meaning that you are breaking the rules that I just explained, and then there's no point in having a discussion with somebody who doesn't want to discuss things honestly and openly. So that is my little contribution. And again, I'm just this guy sitting in his office and talking to his webcam and spouting out his opinions all over the internet with only in a world with billions of people, only a fraction of those will hear this, and that's perfectly fine. If there's one thing that I have found out to be true in my life is that even small things that you do can have huge impacts over the years with people you never meet or hear of. Over the years, I've had so many times people reach out of the blue over something that I said or did or wrote that helped them. And it could be something like, for instance, somebody contacted me and said, I used your book for heavy bag training to help me prepare for my law enforcement exam, my entry exam. I never thought that that would be the case. And so I've had people contact me saying that, what you said saved my life. When it's something that I was teaching online or something I wrote online about self-defense, I said I used that and it saved my life. I don't typically talk about that because I don't like to get too involved with believing my own hype and marketing, but it is true. It happens. So that's why I think if you try to act like this in the way we just talked about today, I think it's more productive than anything else. You might disagree with certain aspects of this, but I think the alternative, just shouting at each other, cussing people out, looking at them as they are the enemy, all of them, every single one of them, regardless of nuance or context, that is the road to some very, very difficult times, hard times that end up badly for usually everybody involved. And I think we're at this point in time where trying to have a sort of revival of rational discussion is a good thing, so that things simmer down a little bit and don't escalate as much. Now, again, I am fully aware that me in my little corner of the world creating this episode of my podcast, it's going to have a very, very small effect in the grand scheme of things. And that is perfectly fine. Like I said, if only one person hears this and it helps them engage in a good faith discussion with somebody else, and as a result of that, a certain amount of problems are avoided in both these people's lives, that's a huge win already. Because it's a proof of concept, meaning it proves that it is possible to use this stuff, these kind of guidelines, to get to a good outcome, a better outcome than the alternative, which is to be emotional and outraged and shout at each other, which tends to lead to conflict and violence. Right, that's it, guys. I'm going to call it for today. As always, like, share, subscribe, follow me on Patreon for a bunch of stuff that is only available there, and I will talk to you next time.